ADHD meds, they work differently than we thought. So this is a headline that's been going around for weeks now because a study supposedly showed that everything we know about ADHD medication is wrong. Now, what is this study? What does it actually say and what doesn't it say? And what does this mean for people who have ADHD? Today I'm going to break it down for you from a drug scientist perspective. Now, before we get into this idea of what the study actually did, you need to understand a little bit of the background on ADHD medication. So before we even had people with ADHD, before that was a diagnosis, which started in 1980, we used ADHD medication for kind of other things. We used to actually give amphetamine, so similar to those ADHD medications, we used to give drugs similar to that to keep people awake. So for example, in pilots who are trying to stay awake through combat situations, we'd basically just give them speed. And it worked very well, but also incredibly addictive, so we stopped doing that. But then we found out that things like lisdexamfetamine, so other types of amphetamines, they actually worked pretty well at treating some of these, quote, behavioral problem children, which was the term that was widely used for kids who had ADHD before we actually had the diagnosis for them. Now, one of the main theories and kind of like the neuroscience behind ADHD is that ADHD, one of the issues is that there's kind of this lack of attention. So there's not as much dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, and therefore it is harder to focus and pay attention. And so some of those drugs out there are specifically working to increase dopamine in that area and then do things like increase attention. So this study was basically like, yeah, we do see that there are problems with the prefrontal cortex in a lot of the studies, but also there's other areas that we can't explain. So when it comes to things like attention, the authors are basically saying like, we don't actually have a lot of really good evidence that it is specifically attention. Stimulants do help people with attention if they had very low levels of attention and focus in the first place. But for those high performers, ADHD meds did not actually seem to help that much. And there was a suggestion that it could hurt. Now, that is its own study, and I will talk about that study at some point in the future because I have thoughts on it. So I don't know if I fully believe that idea yet, but that is what they based this article on. The data from this study comes from like this bigger study that's been going on for years, which is known as the ABCD study. So it is looking at how children develop over time. So this specific experiment looked at one part of that bigger study, and it was looking at children who had been diagnosed with ADHD and who were prescribed stimulants. So it was looking at what is happening in the brains of children who had actually taken the stimulant that morning before they had that brain scan. Only 3% of the original, like almost 6,000 participants were in this little aspect of it, and only a third of them had actually taken stimulants the morning of. Now, there's something weird going on with this. They found that only 1 in 5 of the children who had been prescribed stimulants and had taken them that morning, only 1 in 5 of them had actually been kind of diagnosed with ADHD according to the diagnostic criteria that the study used. And then they're like, okay, we'll just loosen our criteria. So maybe we're just like a little too harsh when it comes to what we consider ADHD. And even when they loosened it, only 75% of the children prescribed stimulants met the criteria for ADHD. So what's going on with those other 25% of the kids? Why are they taking stimulants? So they looked at those kids who had taken stimulants and they kind of worked backwards. They're like, here is what the brain looks like with those kids who are on stimulants. So the scientists were like, okay, so we see changes in these areas linked to things like motor activity, and also linked to things like memory. But we don't see changes in these attention areas. So these networks that are like associated with how we pay attention or focus on things. And they also said that like people's brains on stimulants look like people who just slept more. And they did this by asking the parents how long their kid usually sleeps for, like in general, how many hours do they sleep? That was what they kind of like used as their measure. And then they looked at like what patterns of activation were found in the brain of somebody who slept more, and then said like, oh yeah, that looks very similar to the pattern of brain activation found with somebody who's on stimulants. And then they use those results to suggest that stimulants aren't working on attention, but instead are working on things like our ability to be awake. Now, what's interesting here is that when they get into this, like, oh, we didn't find anything in those attentional areas, this main idea of like, oh, it's not actually attention and focus, it's actually these other things. They cite some huge flaws with their study. So they're like, yeah, it could be that we found no differences in attention because we just didn't have enough people doing this very complicated task to show differences. And that is a huge problem when the core crux of your entire experiment is that ADHD meds are not working on attention. Instead, they're working on these other areas. Like, it could actually just be that they didn't have enough people to see if it worked in this area in the first place. Their entire argument that it is more reward and persistence. So it's more like you are becoming more motivated to do the task. You enjoy the task more. You are more awake. It's more that than attention. That is based on the premise that there is no effect of attention, which could just be a flaw of the experiment. So maybe everything we think we know about ADHD meds isn't actually wrong. And now, from my perspective, I think that all of these things can be correct. ADHD meds are probably helping us with things like attention and focus. In fact, the study was basically like, we don't have a good definition of attention in the first place. Yeah, that is a huge flaw. Like, this study got a lot of attention and is published in a pretty good journal. But to me, the actual conclusions that they make are not justified but by what they actually did. Like, the whole premise that, oh yeah, sleep and our wake cycle is involved because the children who self-report got more sleep, their brains looked like the children who were on stimulants. That's a very tenuous connection to me, y'all. And then there's just like weird things about this study. So for example, in one part of the study, they're like, oh yeah, and then we replicated this in 5 adults so that we could look at how stimulants affect their brain too. And it turns out that that was actually part of a bigger study in which they gave people either Ritalin or shrooms to see how it changes brain connections, which led to a paper saying psilocybin desynchronizes the human brain, which I'm going to do a video about at some point too. But like, why are you giving them either Ritalin or shrooms? What is that study? What is the reasoning behind giving those 2 drugs? Now, not together at different time points, but still, why? So in my personal opinion, I do not think the headlines are actually justified by the study. The study was messy, and yes, the human brain is messy too. Our eyes are backwards. You can make small changes in the brain and convince somebody that they're blind when they're actually not. Or maybe there's just a persistent ringing in your ear that you hear for no reason. Our brain does weird things, and it's probably a combination of a whole bunch of different things occurring at once. So yes, ADHD meds probably do affect things like reward and persistence, and maybe even things like changes in how awake you feel. Could they also affect attention? Yeah, it's not mutually exclusive, and we should probably look into all of those options.